Hello, listeners of the Timur Podcast. My name is Sam Hume, and I'm the host of Pax Britannica. Pax Britannica is a narrative history podcast on the British Empire. Season 1 covered the start of English colonisation in North America and the Caribbean, the first decades of the East India Company, and the ruthless politics of the British Isles. Season 2 has just begun on the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Civil war and revolution erupt in England, Ireland, and Scotland, pitting the forces of Charles I against his own subjects. By the end, the king will be dead, the monarchy abolished, and Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell will be at the head of a militarised and expansionist commonwealth. If any of that sounds interesting to you, you can find Pax Britannica everywhere you find good podcasts, such as where you listen to James. Now, on with your regularly scheduled podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I go back to investigate the life, conquests, character, and legacy of Amir Timur, Tamerlane, or as we call him here, Timur. Now, before we jump into this, I do have two quick show updates. I'll keep them short though. First of all, it's been quite a while since our last episode, unfortunately. It's been like over a month. I don't actually know how long it's been. I'm too afraid to look. At the end of this episode, though, I will give a very brief explanation and update for those of you who might be concerned. However, I know many people are more interested in the history, so we're just going to put that at the end of the episode and dive into things now. But one more thing, and that is that the last few months I've been receiving quite a lot of feedback, which is awesome. I really love hearing from you. But this has included a bit of constructive criticism. Now, that's good. I need the constructive criticism. You and I both know I have a lot of improving to do. So always feel free to let me know about how you think things are going and any recommendations you might have. I probably won't call you mean names, but that's not a promise. Anyway, I've had quite a few people point out how I have apologized for or joked about the loud noises coming from my neighbors. You know that I've done this quite a bit, and several people have reached out saying that you can't actually hear anything. And guess what? Yeah, you're completely right. Now, I swear to you that my neighbors are actually making noises. I hope they're not in my head, but maybe they are. Apparently, though, my microphone doesn't pick it up. Regardless, I really appreciate this feedback. Thank you for reaching out and letting me know. From now on, I will not be interrupting the flow of the narrative to comment about things that you can't hear. Thank you to everybody who reached out to me about this. Okay, with all that said, let's get back. Finally, let's dive back into the story of Timur. Last episode, we began our look into the disintegration of the friendship and alliance between Timur and Husayn. These two men had been friends, allies, and brothers-in-law for years. They had conquered, bled, been defeated. They had fled from battles, been imprisoned, and ruled together. For the past few years, their stories, their journeys were inseparable. They were this team. But as we saw, and as we will continue to see for the next 35 years or so, Timur is not intent on sharing his rule with anybody, even somebody who had been as close to him as Husayn. And so, the ambition of Timur, coupled with the possible ineptitude of Husayn's style of rule, in a country where secession or revolt to further tribal autonomy was commonplace, due to this collective scenario, civil war broke out. Brother was set against brother. Now, this was probably a broader conflict than just Timur revolting against Husayn. There were likely other players. For example, we saw how a tribal leader named Shir Bahram Kudalani allied with Timur before hiding in the mountains for a while and then joining Husayn. And we also saw how Bahram Jalayir also joined Timur before he ran off, pillaged the countryside, and then fled. But these two cases show us that there were other political players than just Husayn and Timur. So there were likely other tribes or tribal leaders who were displeased with Amir Husayn's rule. Generally, the way steppe politics worked was that if an emir or a khan or what have you was an ineffective ruler and couldn't keep the tribes in order, many of his subjects would break away rather quickly. But if the ruler managed to get things under control and defeat at least some of the rebels, it's likely that many of the other rebel tribes would turn around again and bend the knee. This was an all-ever-changing sea of political waves, as we've seen many times and will continue to see for the entire duration of this podcast. But for now, Timur had no intention of submitting to Husayn. The situation had progressed beyond that. The Zafarnama tells us that Husayn sent Timur what appears to have been a genuine plea. A plea that Timur remember their friendship, to just disband your army, humbly return to me, return to my embrace. But Timur had refused. Thus, put yourself in Husayn's shoes for a minute. What do you do? What can you do besides gathering your men to defeat your friend? And what thoughts are going through your head when you're marching with your men towards Timur's encampment? Will you defeat him? What happens if you lose? Or perhaps the most difficult question to answer is, what happens if you do capture Timur? Can you kill a man who only so recently you called a brother and an ally? As we finished last episode, we saw that Timur ran into yet another bit of bad luck. Seeing his precarious position, Timur's old allies, the Yasa-Uri tribal warriors, packed their bags and deserted him. Why fight for a man who was in such a doomed position? Husayn had the majority of the support, the money, the food, the territory, and most importantly, the people behind him. To fight against that could very well be suicide. When Timur heard about the departure of the Yasa-Uri, some of his soldiers offered to go after them, bring back the Yasa-Uri leaders in chains, execute them for betraying the cause. But Timur, as we're told, refused to allow his men to do this and instead insisted that the Yasa-Uri and anybody else who wished to leave, they are free to do so. Now, on a tactical level, this was pretty dumb. Timur needs every man he can get, and even then it might be hopeless. We know this, he knows this, they all know this. Giving your men the option to peacefully leave could evaporate his army in a matter of minutes. However, diplomatically this was brilliant. Chasing after the Yasa-Uri and then executing them as deserters and traitors might have been the expected thing to do. Use fear to keep your army together. But now, when Timur lets them go because he recognizes their simple desire to do what's best for their tribe, well, that makes all of Timur's other allies realize that this guy actually is a great leader. A great leader who respects his subordinates enough to let them look out for themselves and their people. That's huge. And as we're told, instead of fleeing, the rest of Timur's men and allies were reinvigorated to fight for the cause. And hearing this, many Yasa-Uri men also returned, although the exact time of their return is a bit fuzzy. It might have been now, it might have been a few months later, or maybe it was a bit of both. Some guys return now, some later. Either way, Timur had kept most of his army from breaking apart, and just in the nick of time too, because Husayn's scouts are spotted on the horizon. Now, as we've seen several times already in this story, the diplomatic politics of the steppe were not always life or death situations. People changed sides, tribes changed sides, and compromises were often made. And so following this tradition, and undoubtedly paired with their personal history, Husayn sends a request to Timur. Husayn wants to meet with Timur. Let's leave our armies behind. Sure, just bring a couple hundred bodyguards, but then let's meet together and talk things out. No need destroying most of these men and possibly ourselves when diplomacy might actually be what's best for both of us. As the Zafarnama claims, this was because Husayn wanted to renew their friendship and talk about peace options. Timur's alleged memoirs take it a bit further and claim that Husayn was willing to split Mawarnar between the two of them. But whatever the details, this was what seemed like a peaceful step in the right direction. And for Timur, who knew he likely didn't have enough men to overcome his former brother-in-law, this was a golden opportunity, so Timur agreed to meet. Per the arrangement, Timur left his army with only about 300 of his closest and most loyal soldiers. But he wasn't about to go just waltzing blindly into the loving embrace of his former brother. He prepared for the worst. And so as he approached the designated meeting point, he set 200 of these men to turn around and set up defensive fortifications, keep watch for a possible ambush, and if we return running, get ready for a fight. So Timur presses on with the remaining 100 men. They arrive at the place and find nobody. Well, perhaps Husayn is late. We can wait. Nothing. Now, the men are getting a little bit antsy, and as if in response to this, they see dust on the horizon getting closer and closer. And as we're told, 3,000 of Husayn's horsemen quickly riding down on their positions, weapons drawn and banners flying. It's an ambush. Timur quickly orders for his 100 men to form a defensive ring in between a narrow hill pass. And as any good strategist will tell you, if you can bottleneck an overwhelming enemy into a tight area, you can stand a pretty good chance, even if they greatly outnumber you. Because funneling them into a narrow area, an area where your small numbers can adequately defend, their numerical advantage is nullified. Not only that, but they've also been forced into what is often called a kill zone. Large concentrations of men forced or trapped into a tiny area where they can't maneuver, attack, or defend adequately. But this did not stop Husayn's men, and they quickly plunged into Timur's defensive line. We're told that they were following Husayn's orders to ambush and to kill Timur. Yazdi, as always, makes this battle come alive with his descriptions. He says, "The enemy arrived, and there were great cries on both sides. The arrows fell like hail, and the fight was so bloody." But Timur's tactic had worked. His men were being pushed back, sure, but not overrun. Soon, though, Timur ordered for an organized retreat through the hill pass back to the 200 men waiting in reserve, and thankfully for him and his men, Husayn's soldiers did not pursue. Timur linked up with the 200 others, and they rode as fast as they could back to his main army, because who knows how close Husayn is with his full force. And then, as we're so used to with the happenings of Timur's early life, things go from bad to worse. Upon arriving at the camp where his army was supposed to be, Timur finds nobody. No signs of battle, no bodies, just empty. It turns out that as his army had heard about the ambush and knowing that Timur only had with him about 300 men, they assumed he was dead. And so, doing what was best for their own survival and for the survival of their tribes, they fled, they scattered. Now, to pause the story and to back up just a little bit, the version of this little ambush battle that I just told you is not the only version out there. Of course it's not, right? But no, Timur's memoirs, his supposed autobiography, gives a much different interpretation. According to that version, Husayn ambushed Timur, just like we saw, but then Timur manages to maneuver his troops around so that he became the one doing the ambushing, and Husayn's men are massacred. But what's odd about this is that Husayn rebuilt his massive army in literally the next paragraph of this source, which might be a bit suspicious. Plus, our more reliable sources tell us that Timur was fleeing the ambush and certainly was nowhere close to reversing the outcome and actually winning the battle. Still though, the version of these events got me thinking. Did this battle play out in a way that we don't have a record of? Because we always have to remember that our sources we have on Timur and Husayn are overwhelmingly, completely pro-Timur. Further, these sources were written decades or centuries after the events happened and were probably influenced by some healthy doses of historical revisionism. But of this ambush by Husayn, here are the points they all seem to agree upon. Number 1, there was a battle between Timur and Husayn. Number 2, after the battle, Timur had no army, probably only a few hundred men. And 3, Husayn was back up to full strength very soon after. Now, I look at these 3 points, and I'm a pessimist, so I think literally everything in this world is political propaganda, including this podcast probably, and also in this case that we're talking about, it could be later Timurid propaganda to paint Timur in the best of lights. And so I think, wait, what if Husayn actually crushed Timur in this battle? There was no ambush, no peace talks, no betrayal at all. It was just a good old medieval battle, and Timur soundly lost. It still checks all of our boxes. There's a battle, Timur's army disappears, and Husayn keeps his. Plus, in addition to this, it seems a bit odd and maybe out of character for Husayn to lie about possible peace talks when he sent out pleas earlier that seemed to have been genuine. And if you're a pro-Timur writer, it would be awfully convenient if Husayn was a lying piece of backstabbing scum rather than an honorable opponent. Now, is this what actually happened? I don't know. We don't know. But it's fun to play around with events like this, and the point of it is this. Timur, whether he won the battle or lost, whether it was an ambush or a pitched battle, Timur needs to get the hell out of here, because his army is gone. Maybe they dispersed, fearing he was dead, maybe they had been crushed by Husayn. Doesn't matter, Timur needs to flee. Now, there is a city that is the obvious point for Timur to retreat to. The problem is, I couldn't find a definitive way of how to pronounce the city's name. It could be Qarshi or just Qarsh. I've seen both, I've heard both. I don't know which one is more accurate. I'm going to call it the city of Qarshi, but just know that might not be correct. Anyway, the city of Qarshi is situated near the southern border of Uzbekistan. Qarshi was an obvious choice for Timur to flee to. It was nearby, he had allies there, and in prior years when he had actually held a position of leadership under Husayn, he had devoted resources to building up the walls and the citadel of the city. So he already knows what defenses are available there, and defenses are absolutely what he needs right now. Now, the topic of Qarshi brings us to a new section of our show that I'm quite excited for. While reading history, but especially military history, and especially the career of a conqueror like Timur, it's easy for me to fall into a trap. Sometimes the names of people and places can easily blend together and lose their identity for me. I've caught myself doing this many times with the Mongols, or Napoleon, or yes, with Timur. I come across a city after city after city after city, and as awful as this is, sometimes these places just become meaningless names in my head. They're just yet another city that succumbed to man's lust for power, right? We've seen it happen a million times. We're going to see it many more times. It's just a city after another city after another city destroyed, and they begin to blend together sometimes. But I want to make sure that we don't do that. They're places that are not from some dusty old book. They're real places that had real people and, in most cases, still have real people there. So from now on, as Timur encounters and conquers different cities, we're going to pause the narrative for a few minutes in order to dive into a brief history of whatever city that is. We're going to find out how old that city is, what kind of people lived there, what life was like prior or during the onset of Timur, and what this place looks like today. The amount of time we spend on city will fluctuate, but I'm hoping to do this with every city. And I also hope that by doing this, it'll better flesh out this place for us in history, in the story, and in the world around us. So Timur is retreating to Qarshi, but just what exactly is or was Qarshi? Well, first of all, Qarshi is, not was, but is. It's still populated today. Now, going way back, the city gained regional prominence starting in about 700 BCE, although humans may have lived here for centuries or even millennia before then. But with the Sogdian and Persian empires, the city really started to thrive. The city itself is located on the Silk Road, on an oasis, and also between the mighty cities of Balkh and Bukhara. Thus, constant trade along with the farming of wheat, silk, and cotton really set the city up well for success. Now, skipping forward a year or two, or 2000, with the Mongol invasions, the city of Qarshi was incorporated into the Chagatai Khanate. The Mongols and later Chagatai Mongols were quite fond of Qarshi and the surrounding pasture land. Genghis Khan himself spent several summers here grazing his vast herds of horses, and years later, Khan Kazan, if you remember him, built a palace here as well. Around where we are now in the story, in the year 1364, Timur built fortifications here, and because of these various construction projects, Qarshi gained its current name. Qarshi is derived from the Old Mongolian word for fort. And under Timur's rule, Qarshi flourished for decades, and it's here that you can find some of the most magnificent works of what's called Timurid architecture. And if that sounds intriguing, don't worry, we will talk a lot about Timurid architecture later on down the road. Anyway, Qarshi continued to be a prominent city, and the prominence only increased. From the late 1700s to the early 1900s, Qarshi was under the protection of the Emirate of Bukhara, and was arguably the second most important city in the emirate. Beginning in 1873, though, and lasting for about a century, Qarshi, along with most of Central Asia, came under Russian and then later Soviet protection and rule. Today, Qarshi is one of the largest and most prominent cities in Uzbekistan, with about 300,000 people living in it. It is known for its massive cotton production, its large deposits of natural gas, its famous woven carpets, and yes, still its Timurid architecture. So hopefully that helps flesh the city out a bit. With other cities, we'll probably spend more time on them, but I wanted to start this tradition with Qarshi. Anyway, as discussed, Qarshi at the time of Timur was not only a prize worth having in this civil war, but it was also quite defensible. So, for now, retreating from Husayn, Qarshi became the obvious rally point for Timur. Once at Qarshi, Timur and his closest followers and allies held a kind of war council in order to discuss the next plan of action. Eventually, the decision was made to abandon the city because a huge army led by an ally of Husayn was close on their tails, and Timur perceived that he didn't have enough strength or supplies to hold the city. Thus, the plan was for each tribal leader to return to their lands and their people and, in short, just survive. And if they could survive, then their job was to gather as many of their men as they could so that in a few months' time, Timur could reassemble his sizable army once again. But for now, what can they do but run? According to both Timur's alleged memoirs and the Zafarnama, Husayn's forces reached Qarshi the very next day after Timur and Timur's men had left. Husayn's men found Qarshi completely undefended and quickly moved in to secure it. Meanwhile, across Transoxiana or Mawarnar, Husayn was cementing his grasp. Samarkand was secured, Bukhara was taken. The anti-Husayn rebellion appeared to be on the brink of destruction. As for Timur, though, he is now again being forced to flee for his life out of Transoxiana. And while his men lay scattered or destroyed, his enemies secure in their victory, and Husayn left comfortably consolidating his power, Timur turned his horse to his old familiar backup plan. Timur, again, fled into the surrounding Karakum desert. Thank you for listening to the Timur Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or whatever listening platform you're using is greatly appreciated and helps the show. As always, feel free to reach out to me by email at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Facebook at TimurPod or on Twitter at PodcastTimur. Now, as to why there hasn't been an episode in a month or so and how I've been missing in action, I'll keep it short. Basically, there were some health and mental issues that kind of blew up, and I really needed to take care of them, and I have. So, well, it's a process. I'm working it through, but I'm in a better place. So thank you for just hanging in there with me. Thank you for the encouragement. I've gotten so much encouragement. I really appreciate that. We should be back to normal, but speaking of what normal is, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The bad news is, and I may have said this before, I can't remember, but the bad news is right now, where I am in life, I can't keep a schedule. I cannot predict when the next episode will release. The goal is to release every Thursday, every week, but I'm just not in a place where I can promise that. So for where I am now, just hang in there and episodes will be released when I can finish them. Hopefully. But the good news is that the Timur Podcast is not going anywhere. I'm not ending it. I'm not burnt out. I enjoy every minute of making this thing, except for the editing. But every other minute I really enjoy. And I've got so many plans. There's so many things I want to do, but I just don't have the time right now to do it. But with that said, thanks for listening. Thank you for your support. Next episode, we will continue with the war between Timur and Husayn. There's still quite a bit to cover with this, and it has some surprising twists and turns. But after this, then we're pretty close to when Timur becomes Amir of Transoxiana. And that, in turn, brings us to the beginning of his conquests. Find out how this begins next time right here on the Timur Podcast.